All right, y'all, we are live on YouTube.
All right. Welcome back to the 10th Annual SISE Conference. In case you missed it or need another refresher, Monday's speakers, Secretary Chu, former Secretary of Energy Dan Poneman, Chief Advisor to the Secretary Melanie Kenderdine. Basically, they all discussed either anecdotally or with data the gigaton scaled carbon problems that we face. This Tuesday morning, we had Chris Gould, the Chief Innovation and Sustainability Officer with Exelon, discuss how his company is confronting these gigaton scale challenges. Nobel Prize winners, former secretaries of energy, COOs of companies and agencies, all tremendous. And yet this upcoming presentation by the UN SDSN and Evolved Energy Research, I can assure you this is the anticipated highlight for all of us. Thank you for being here. To summarize, Evolved Energy Research, along with the UN SDSN, will consider and discuss their recent report on the gigaton scale carbon challenges and SDGs faced by the Midwest. Need I remind you, their report speaks directly to this conference. Basically, we need to reduce CO2 emissions to net zero quickly, but do it in a way that ensures and protects justice, fairness, equality, and so on. Elena Crete will draw on her work on sustainable development. Ryan Jones and his insights about the utility grid. Jamil Farbs will offer a holistic vision of energy systems. In a way, they offer a roadmap. Don't get me wrong, even though the report serves as a brilliant roadmap, the effort won't be easy. The scope, scale, and rate of physical changes that need to happen are overwhelming. But if the Midwest can succeed, then the UN, SDSN, and Evolved Energy have provided the world with best practices for a global transition. Elena, Jamil, Ryan, there are questions pouring in already, but you know what? You go for it. Let's have you do it.
Great, thank you, Eric. Thank you for that awesome introduction. No pressure or anything. Jamil, do you want to pop up our slides? So we're actually going to try and do our session a little bit differently today. We've broken it up into 3 segments, and we're going to pause after each one and actually take your questions after each section. So we're going to start with explaining some of the motivation and the long-term planning methodology that we undertook in this study. And then we're going to go into our national approach and some of the results from there that are some of the premise there, and also then really dig into the regional results. Jamil, I can see you in presenter view. You might want to just do full screen.
Yeah.
But I'll just jump in. But to get us started, I just want to introduce myself and where this concept came from generally. So I work with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We have a mandate from the Secretary General to help implement the SDGs, which is obviously not an easy task. So we do this through a global network of knowledge producing research institutions and universities. And we have 38 national and regional SDSNs that we organize around. So they're all working to localize the SDGs. So that might mean collecting data or developing local projects on the ground for sustainability. We also teach the SDGs. So we have an online academy that has over 30 massive open online courses that are free and open. We source content from our networks and also use our networks to disseminate that information. And then also implementing the SDGs. This is mainly done through consortium building and being an intermediary for our networks and our members to their local governments, their national governments, and the bigger UN consortiums, the UNFCCC, the COP processes, really trying to link in the bottom grassroots efforts with these global macro issues. And if there's any agenda that's more encompassing of gigaton challenges, it's definitely the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. Jamil, next slide. So about a year and a half ago, our SDSN USA network really decided they wanted to focus on SDG 7, which is on energy access, reliability, and modern electricity energy for all, and also SDG 13, which is about taking action for climate change. Obviously, in the last few years and even years before that, we saw states, cities, local municipalities making these commitments to either completely cleaning up the energy system, 100% renewable energy by mid-century, or zero emissions by mid-century. And while committing to those goals is a first step to getting on that pathway, actually implementing them or getting on that pathway is a different question. So our network was really asking the question of how, if even with a big ambitious goal, how do we actually get there? Where do we start? How do we prioritize where to start? And that's when we started or continued working really with Evolved Energy Research in their deep decarbonization pathways modeling work. Ryan, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Elena. Hey, everybody. So my name is Ryan Jones. I'm one of the co-founders of Evolved Energy Research. I'm going to walk us through the next section here before we take a pause for questions. Jamil, I'm noticing that the slides are a bit cut off on the slide. I'm not or on the sides. I'm not sure if that's just my screen or if other people are seeing that as well.
I see it as well.
Jamil, maybe if you go out of presentation mode, that may just be easier.
Yeah, make sure everybody can see the slides.
Yeah. At least we can see the whole side here. Okay, so to kind of start out with just framing the approach that we take in studying these deep decarbonization pathways, it's our first focus is on the endpoint. So understanding in the context of what we're going to speak to today is how to get to a net zero energy scenario by 2050. And then using that endpoint, we work backwards to say, all right, if that's the goal, what needs to happen over the next 30 years between now and then to reach that target. And it's a little bit different than some of the approaches that are oftentimes taken, which are more focused on forecasting, focused on near-term policy, and kind of adding up those incremental measures. We're focused on the infrastructure, and here's what needs to happen, and the pace that's implied by the fact that this is the target. And then the next step is, from our perspective, is if that's the infrastructure transition, what are the policies that actually take us there? Next slide, Jamil. So a bit more background here in kind of thinking of the role of these long-term pathways. And I'd like to illustrate this using this kind of stock replacement concept here on the left. So as we know, there are a lot of equipment and energy, both that consumes energy and also produces energy with very long lifetimes, right? So as energy modelers, this is something we think a lot about when we're thinking about a 30-year transition. There's this concept of here of kind of how many bites at the apple, if you will, do we get between now and mid-century to take the infrastructure that we have today and make that infrastructure consistent with the net zero scenario in 2050. So, there are some things like light bulbs, right? We know that light bulbs, have a relatively short lifetime. We actually have a lot of chances of getting that right. There are other things like commercial boilers or power plants where, if we put that in over the next 10 years, that's going to exist in 2050, and we better be sure that that is consistent with our long-term goals, right? And the fear or the danger here, if you look at the figure on the right, is if we do this planning poorly, we end up on a dead-end pathway, right? Which is to say we've invested in, maybe a bunch of infrastructure which has actually reduced emissions in the near term, but was not consistent with the long-term goals. And that's why, this type of long-term thinking, we found it to be very valuable in the work that we've done and with the clients that we work with. Next slide, Jamil. So just a bit of some of the historical perspectives on the work that we've done, and this ties into SDSN and the work that Elena has done in partnership with us. So a lot of this started kind of back in early 2012 with the publication of a paper in Science highlighting kind of an early look at what we consider to be kind of the main strategies for decarbonization. I'll get to those in a minute. That paper by our colleague Jim Williams helped lead to the launch of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which I think Elena mentioned, involves 16 country teams from around the world. We, in the US, as part of the US team, we developed a series of models, first one called Energy Pathways, and then a newer one called Rio. And I won't get much into the methodology, but if you look at some of the materials that we've done in the past and some of our publications, you'll see more information about that. After the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, one of the, I think, crowning achievements of that in the negotiation process was to get actually a provision in the Paris Agreement that pushed countries and suggested countries to create these type of long-term goals and long-term strategies. And before that point, there had been a real focus on kind of near-term contributions, which, as I think we all know, have not added up to the the level of emission reductions that science has said is necessary. But that kind of near-term approach, I think, was hampering the overall kind of planning process from a climate perspective. And I'll go to the next slide here, Jamil. So back in 2014, when we really started the kind of current type of modeling that we're doing now, the research questions that we had were, is 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050 technically feasible? And if so, is it affordable? And our findings to those questions were, first, a definitive yes, it is possible, and as a matter of fact, we can do so with existing technology, and then with a net cost of about 2% of GDP. Next slide, Jamil. So over the last 5 years, the questions that we've been addressing have shifted somewhat, and now we're asking the question is it possible to go even further by 2050? Right, we have less time to act, but it's, in many ways, the science has become more imperative that we reach the emissions reductions that Jamil and I are going to talk about today, with things like the IPCC's 1.5 degree report. So is net zero possible in 2050? Is that technically feasible? And then if so, what is the least cost pathway to get there? And that's some of what Jamil and I will discuss in the next section. So I think we're going to pause for questions here. Elena, is that right?
Yeah, perfect. I haven't seen any come in the chat, but if anybody wants to step in, is this kind of pathway planning new to you all? Have you seen this before? Any specific questions on our history?
So we have one question here about how do we model big random events like COVID-19? So it's a great question, and not something that we really have the capability of doing in the context of this type of modeling. What we do try to take into account are some of the big uncertainties. So future fuel prices, technology costs, availability of biomass, some of the key inputs that are essentially uncertain. We reflect those, run models, and then try to really look at commonalities between scenarios to come up with what we think are robust findings and robust results. The kind of big random events, the unknown unknowns, are definitionally, I think, really hard to represent in models like this, and therefore we miss those.
I can also complement that, Ryan, just in saying well, SDSN doesn't model it either for the reasons Ryan just explained. We actually last week released our Global Sustainable Development Report, where we actually index countries' progress across all of the 17 SDGs. And this year, for the first time, we actually did a COVID index. So we were assessing how prepared countries were and then how they dealt with the preliminary stages of it over the last few months. So if you're interested to learn more, please go check that out. And I can share that link with Eric later to share with you all.
So there's another quick question here on agriculture for biofuels. What percentage of the world's agriculture is used for biofuels? I'm not sure internationally. I can say in the US, about 40% of our corn goes to ethanol production, blending in with gasoline fuel. That's the biggest biofuel produced right now in the US. And we'll get to, I think, more detail on some of the biofuels as we go further along.
Sebastian had another question here, Ryan, about how we created the DDPPs for the different countries and working with country teams and how we establish those connections and partnerships.
Why don't you answer that, Elena, from SDSN's perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So SDSN coordinated the effort with a research institution, IDRI, out of Paris. And we actually worked with our network hosts, which are universities, as I mentioned before, to seek different departments who are either working on energy or climate science and developed in-country teams. And so they were all based off the preliminary assumptions and methodology, but then designed their own individual pathways specific to the conditions in their countries. So SDSN served as like a central mediary and interlocutor, making sure that the results were comparable, but each country team worked rather independently.
Great, we've got two questions here that are somewhat related about kind of future projections of GDP and future projections of energy services. So we have the benefit of having a kind of canonical future energy projection from the US government, which is the US Annual Energy Outlook. And that produces a forecast of energy services. And what I mean by energy services are, an energy service, it's a thing like vehicle miles traveled, right? So, technology efficiency is the missing link there to get to final energy demand. But for things like, vehicle miles traveled, amount of heating or cooling, industrial production, so for all those variables, we have future projections going out to 2050. And what's, one powerful thing about starting with those projections is we can show, using the US government's own forecasts of energy services, we can still reach these decarbonization targets. And so therefore, that is oftentimes the starting place for this type of analysis.
Can we maybe invite Zygmunt, if you'd like to turn on your mic and ask your question, and then we'll have time for one more afterwards.
Hi, I just asked in terms of the cost for achieving the emission reduction. I'm wondering if in order to achieve that goal, we need to create more jobs like in the industry. So does that contribute to the GDP growth? So I'm wondering the 2%, it costs 2% of the GDP to achieve that goal. I'm wondering if that counts for the new jobs, and does it already contribute to the GDP growth?
Yeah, so two points here. First is that 2% estimate was from research in 2014. So as I'll highlight here in the next section, the estimates of cost that we have actually come down significantly due to recent technology improvement. The next thing is that projection does not take into account the benefits of either reduction in air pollution, so improved air quality and improved criteria pollutants, improved health, or the benefits of avoided climate damages. So I'll just, those are really big caveats. On the jobs front, I think we don't expect there to be a huge net kind of change in jobs between now and 50, I think, with this transition. The type of jobs that we will have will change, and that is a challenge, both in I mean, it's a challenge and it's an opportunity. It's a challenge in terms of kind of retraining workforces and making sure that communities that have job loss are kind of appropriately not left behind in this transition, right? But there are kind of many new jobs, I think, that come into this transition that are very good jobs over the next 50 years.
Great. Right, I say maybe we jump to the next section. Yeah, because we're going to start answering questions before we present on them. And Reed, that includes your question that you have in there. So if you're still questioning that afterwards, let me know.
Sounds good. All right, go ahead, Janelle. So summary of national findings here. So in our latest research, we show it's possible to get to net zero by 2050 for a net cost of 0.4% of GDP. Again, not counting some of the co-benefits of that transition. Our least cost zero carbon pathway is primarily driven by renewable energy, and this is a result that's changed over the last 5 or 6 years as a function of continuing cost declines in wind and solar. And then finally, the actions that we need to take over the next 10 years, I think, are very well understood and consistent across a wide range of sensitivities, which I mentioned before. And some of the key kind of outstanding questions and uncertainties really come post 2035. Next slide, Jamil. So there are two models that I mentioned that we use. One is energy pathways, where we create annual energy demand, a final energy demand for basically all fuel types for all subsectors of the economy. Those get passed into an optimization model called RIO, which does kind of very high granularity operations of the supply side of the energy system, including electricity and fuels, to kind of select the way to meet the final energy demand that minimizes present value cost. Next slide, Drew. So just another note in the methodology here. We study this across 16 regions in the US. So we do electricity dispatch, transmission build between each of these regions, and kind of study the demand side transition across each of the regions as well. Next slide, Jamil. So just to illustrate kind of the way this transition can occur from starting from the demand side and ending at emissions. I'm going to talk about the pillars of decarbonization in just a moment, so we'll come back to that concept there that's in the title. But the first piece here, and this is light duty vehicles, we see sales over time. So it's a rapid adoption of electric vehicles on the sales side. That results in the stock that you see in the second panel. So there's a lag here because of the infrastructure inertia in the lifetimes of equipment, which we had discussed before. There's a lag here, between the sales and the stock. Electric drivetrains for vehicles are far more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles, so on a final energy basis. And that's part of what you're seeing there in the third panel with energy, where we've got kind of a big reduction in final energy demand, and then the blue at the bottom, which is electricity. And then as we decarbonize our electricity system at the same time that we transition to electricity for on-road transportation, we see a resulting, very steep reduction in the emissions until we get very low emissions in 2050. So that's kind of an illustration of how some of these things in our pathway work together. Next slide, Camille. So these are just two kind of emission snapshots, one with annual CO2 on the left and the other with cumulative CO2 on the right. You'll see this kind of labeled DDP, which stands for Deep Decarbonization Pathway, and that's kind of the central or main case in what we're presenting. So just as a reference, and this level of cumulative emissions, which is kind of under 80 gigatons between now and 2050, that is a level of emissions that at least does not preclude the idea of returning to something like 350 parts per million by 2100 if you had negative emissions in the second half of the century. Next slide, Camille. So across all of our scenarios, there are kind of 4 key strategies or pillars, if you will, that we found to be required. And this was a finding that was robust also across the 16 country teams in the original Deep Decarbonization Pathways project. So the first is electricity decarbonization. So we need to reduce electricity emissions. And the benchmark here is that by 2050, it's basically a 95% reduction in emissions intensity. The next pillar is energy efficiency. And a benchmark here is that by 2050, we need to reduce our per capita final energy demand by 40%. Electrification, which we talked about in vehicles, is a really important component here, and we have a 3x increase in the final energy that comes from electricity or derived from electricity, fuels produced from electricity. And then finally, carbon capture. So there are corners of the economy, be it aviation or industry, which, through either electrification or energy efficiency, still leave fuel demand in 2050. And for many of those, capturing carbon is kind of one of the last ways of reducing those emissions. Also, when we think about making fuels in the future, whether it's biofuels or whether we synthesize fuels from hydrogen and captured carbon, that carbon is needed in that process. So the carbon capture is one thing that we did not find was necessary to reach the 80 by 50 goals, but is kind of an important part of the solution set in a net zero scenario. Next slide, Camille. So there are across these kind of 5 elements, and I won't get into these in detail, but between the scenarios, they vary on the dimensions of electricity mix, the biomass supply and use, carbon capture, as I just mentioned, the ways that we do electricity balancing. So all of these are high renewable systems, as I mentioned, and that raises kind of unique challenges for electricity operations. And then finally, fuel switching, which is both electrification and kind of the use of zero carbon drop-in fuels. Next slide, Camille. So these are our energy Sankeys, which many on the call may be familiar with, but if you're not, the figures go on the left showing primary energy and on the right showing final energy, with kind of the various energy conversions in between, and the widths of each of the lines are proportional to the amount of energy that flows. So in the current energy system, as you can see, we most of our final or our primary energy on the left there comes from natural gas and petroleum, as well as coal, so fossil fuels. And on the figure on the right, in this deep decarbonization pathway, you can see that those have really been replaced with solar, wind, a much lower amount of natural gas, petroleum, and then a larger fraction of biofuels. And you can see that the electricity grid kind of wedge there at the top has expanded greatly. So we have electricity going to industry and transportation at a larger fraction than we do today. And then we've had electrification in buildings, which has reduced the amount of pipeline gas consumption. And then there are kind of new areas of the economy, of the energy economy, that have expanded. One of which here is hydrogen production, as you see, kind of in the red bar, and that hydrogen is used both in transportation for heavy duty transportation. It's used some in industry, and also is used to synthesize fuels, which then get used for feedstocks and chemicals, and transportation applications hard to electrify, like aviation. Next slide, Jamil. So total energy spending, this is a look at gross energy system costs over time between 2020 and 2050. So the reference case is there on the left, and our deep decarbonization pathway is there on the right. You can see there's a large reduction in natural gas and oil products, and a subsequent increase in spending on the electricity grid, that's transmission and wires, renewable power plants. There are some demand side costs associated with putting in higher efficiency, higher building shell, transitions to electric fuels, and then transition to electric vehicles, and then biofuels and synthetic fuels at the top there, in the deep decarbonization case. And the net change in that is what we had talked about before as the 0.4% of total GDP, is kind of the difference in 2050 between these two scenarios. Next slide, Jamil. As we think about that spending on energy, and put it in the context of total US GDP, this is a slide showing total energy spending as a percentage of GDP, both historically and then modeled going forward. So historically, we see quite a bit of variability as a function of oil price shocks over time. Going forward in the future, across all of our scenarios, we're expecting that the kind of percent that we spend on energy in the economy will decline, even if we push very rapidly to net zero systems. And just as a contrast here, you see the DDP scenario there in the blue. If we decide instead to create an economy where we use no fossil fuels at all, anywhere in the economy, the cost is there in the green. So a small increase, but definitely also kind of a doable prospect in terms of cost. Next slide, Camille, and this is our last slide here before, I think, moving on to a section about the Midwest. So as I mentioned, the kind of actions that are required over between now and 2030, I think, have a lot of agreement between different scenarios. And that is, basically we need to ramp up our build rates of renewables very quickly. So by 2030, we need 3.5 times the capacity that we do today. We need to move away from coal also very quickly. So by 2030, coal is less than 1% of our total power generation. We need to start building energy storage. Energy storage plays kind of a unique role in the power system, and if there are questions about that, we can get into that in more detail. But we don't need to hit huge levels of energy storage build by 2030, but we need to start kind of gaining experience in that industry. Maintaining gas generation at the current level. So as we transition quickly off of coal, and as we transition to a high renewable system, that gas is important for reliability, and we can get into that more as well. And then maintain the existing nuclear fleet. to the extent that's kind of safely, that we're safely able to do that. Then we have some benchmarks there for demand side equipment, which are very, very aggressive. Essentially 50% of new sales of light duty vehicles need to be electric by 2030 to be on that least cost pathway. It's possible to still reach net zero if we don't reach some of those sales targets, but what we find in the research is that it's more expensive to do so. And then no new oil and gas transport facilities because they run the risk of becoming stranded assets. All right, I know that was a lot of material really quickly, but I wanted to leave a lot of time for kind of questions and discussion. I know Jamil has a section coming up here on the regional analysis, so we'll get to your questions in time here.
Yeah, so just a really quick section to try to pivot from, back in the grounding that Ryan offered broadly about sort of how we approach this deep decarbonization pathways approach. So Ryan's just talked through at a high level the national results, which sort of begs the question of, why.
Jamil,
Yep.
sorry, can I suggest we answer some questions now, actually, just because there's
Okay,
some
let's do
high level
that.
ones on the cost assumptions and the methodology that I think would be better to understand before you go into the regional context.
Sure.
Sorry, Ryan, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. We'll take try to do it in 5-10 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time to present the regional. But I saw Jamie, Jay, and Victoria all had very great questions on some of the cost results. So Jamie, do you want to step in and pose your question first?
Yeah, I'd love to. First off, thanks for the presentation. It was pretty good. Really good, actually. I was just wondering, so you guys said when you determined the cost of carbon neutrality and you found the 0.4% of GDP, you didn't include any of the benefits. And I was sort of just wondering why, because I know like the costs of saving human life are really high. So there's a chance that it could balance out. I guess I was just curious to your guys' thoughts on why you did what you did.
Yeah, so just to be clear, the main message here on costs is that this is not, the cost is not an impediment to us making this transition, right? And that, that really is the finding. And I think that if you summed up those benefits, and there are many other studies that do that, the benefits outweigh these costs. And I think we all know this, right?
That's sort of what I thought, but I don't know.
No, that's right. So what we're showing is net energy system cost. The reason why we have not quantified those things is mostly because we're not experts in that area of the global climate system or the health benefits, right? So there's nothing that precludes this result here of kind of small modest costs from being paired with other such analysis by other researchers to kind of give that broader picture. So we're really just focused on the energy system, which is where our focus, or where our expertise is. And I just flagged that one of the paradoxes here is that even though the net energy system cost is very small, the financial flows in the economy change in very dramatic ways. So going back to slide 18, Jamil, on growth cost, sorry, 19. So we know from this transition that there is a big question of political economy, because there are, when there are losers, which are the kind of current fossil producers in the economy, and there are winners, which in many ways don't exist yet, right? Or don't exist with the same political power that the losers have in the energy system, which are our renewables, kind of the manufacturers of new efficient demand side equipment, and these other things. So kind of big political economy question, even though the net cost change is not very significant.
I would add too, Jamie, this is obviously just being conservative with our results. So right now, I think costs around like 6% GDP on our energy system, and historically they've been as high as 14%. So our results were already compelling. So in order to just make it as solid as possible, there was no need to add in the additional benefits.
Thank you guys for clarifying.
Great. Jay, do you want to come in? Maybe not. Well, Jay had asked. Oh, there you go. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much. I love technology. It's amazing. To build off of Jamie's question, I'm a little confused. You said that it'll cost 0.4% of our GDP to go net zero by 2050. And I was wondering if you can elaborate how you got to that number specifically. Is that an amortized annual 0.4%, or is it a 0.4% net present value at 2019 dollars, or is it of 2050 dollars itself?
So that cost is basically, if you look at the annual cost in 2050, so just the cost we pay in 2050, which is a combination of kind of payments on capital and operational cost, right? That cost above the reference case is a value which, when you divide it by the total GDP projection of the U.S. annual energy outlook, which is somewhere a bit just under $40 billion or $40 trillion in 2050. That's what gives you the 0.4%.
Oh, so it's not a trend spending over the period. It's a final point in time, correct?
That's right. It's the 2050 snapshot. Got
it. Did your research determine what the total cost over that period would be?
Yeah, we can follow up with that number, because we do have a present value estimate. But I don't want to misspeak right now on the phone. I don't have that in front of me.
Great. And then Nathaniel, do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, I was just sort of wondering about you have all this great data, and there are a lot of different ways to get to that GDP. And it looks different in each sort of community's context. And I was wondering how you're sort of letting people see the impact that different policies have, because if they choose a different pathway, then they're obviously going to get results, and some pathways are not viable in all communities.
Yeah, so the thing that we have not had time here to present are the various sensitivities that we run. So when we look at kind of emphasizing different priorities in the energy system, or look at kind of points of failure in different parts of the technology transition, I think those are what we in part use to kind of eliminate that. This is research that's really focused, as I mentioned at the beginning, on that backcasting approach, where what's the infrastructure transition between now and 2050 that gets us on that least cost pathway. We do other studies where we take policy, put them into our models, and then try to kind of show the impact, right, of those given policies. And we're not presenting those today, but that's another kind of approach or way of going about this.
Okay, thank you.
And then just, I think 2 more we have time for here. Raymond and Suzanne had questions more on the overall scope of the model.
Hi, first of all, thank you, Elena, Ryan, and Jamal for doing this. And my question is, so in the 2050 DDP energy system, geothermal energy doesn't really play a huge role in energy generation. So I'm wondering, is that mainly because of, do you feel like in like your research, did you find that the advancement in technology sort of wasn't there for geothermal energy, or was it sort of more the uncertainty of geothermal energy itself, and like how, I guess, the source of energy sometimes, like for example in California, a bunch of the power plants have gone coal per se, or is that like a combination of all those factors?
So it's really just a factor of cost. So based on the projections that we have of cost, and for renewables, we use the NREL annual technology baseline. geothermal is not competitive with future cost for solar and wind. So we have kind of a maintenance of the existing geothermal, which is kind of cost competitive in the model, but not a huge expansion for that reason.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, last one. It should be a quick one. But Christina, you want to ask your question, and then we'll need to move on to the next section. But I'm already brainstorming with Thomas how we can potentially answer these questions afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the whole panel for coming to talk to us. It's been really exciting to listen to. My question concerns the 4 pillars and how essentially carbon capture has become essential to reaching the net zero goal by 2050. And I was essentially wondering if our assumption that we can reach net zero is because we already have the carbon capture technology in place, or it is available, or if we have to assume innovation is going to occur before then to make it possible.
Yeah. That's a good question, and I maybe wasn't as articulate as I should have been on that carbon capture pillar. So let me try to give that another rundown. So we do have a scenario which is 100% renewable primary energy, where we have no fossil, and even in that scenario, we use carbon capture because we want to get carbon so we can synthesize fuels for things like aviation, right? And so what this doesn't, the pillar does not presuppose what happens to the carbon that you've captured. So in some scenarios, you may sequester it, and others you use the carbon for some, productive use or fuel synthesis. The carbon capture technology itself, I think there is a lot of active research going into different sorbents for removing CO2 from waste streams or from the atmosphere. We have, large pilot scale, carbon capture, both on an industrial level from power plants and direct air capture today. We do expect that cost is going to, come down. But that is, the cost of carbon capture as well as the cost of sequestration are things that I would point to as things that are less well understood, over the next 30 years, right? And so when I mentioned kind of some of the sensitivities that we run, those are some of the things that we want to test and understand how, either if technology does not mature as we expect, or if we have, particular cost breakthroughs or technology performance breakthroughs, what the implications might be.
Great.
Thank you.
I think we should turn to the final part, and then I know that there's some questions still out there, and we might have time for them at the end. So, but keep also adding any new ones. Jamil.
Great. So why regional analysis? There's a lot of deep insights just from sort of the national scale, but this section is to try to help motivate a little bit why we did this regional Midwest study as well as a Southeast regional study. So really, we think there's a really important piece that we don't necessarily get from the national analysis alone about understanding some of the unique opportunities and challenges on a regional basis that really all together can help formulate a national energy transition. So some of those pieces are renewable resource potential looks really different on a regional level, right? And a national analysis alone isn't going to help us understand what regions are net producers, what regions are net consumers. We see a similar dynamic going on with common markets for key technologies, right? So in the Midwest, the requirements of an air source heat pump are going to look really different than in the Southeast. That's a really important consideration, sort of understanding how infrastructure changes over time. And the final piece is that we know that the electricity sector is going to play a really important role in sort of driving the energy transition. So there's another dynamic we can capture by doing a regional analysis, and that's understanding what's happening with energy, with electricity and large-scale energy infrastructure that happens closer to the region that decisions are actually made. So electric transmission is really the big example here, and most of that planning is done really on a regional basis. So the other piece is that it really helps us have insights that can support a shared regional vision to what needs to happen by 2050. And with that vision, it sets up planners and policymakers and stakeholders to tackle some of the really important questions that we know just looking at widgets and infrastructure alone don't answer. So we can start to answer questions about what does an equitable transition look like. We have a better sense of what are sort of the physical changes that need to happen to enable it. As has already been mentioned, so this Midwest study was part of an SDSN effort that also included a Southeastern study. And the particular reason we're focused on the Midwest is that it's roughly 20% of US emissions, but there's really been limited analysis to date about what decarbonization is going to look like in the Midwest and how that actually might impact the region, particularly as it has some major industries that are going to be critical to this transition. So agriculture and the automotive industries. And the analysis included the 9 states in yellow here. So for this study, we really had 2 key research questions. And the first was to understand how energy supply and demand, investment in infrastructure needed to evolve to enable low carbon transition. And the second piece is, given if those things happen, what are some of the key opportunities and challenges in the region? And how do they potentially relate to other regions? So with that, we'll shift to talking about some of the implications as well as the insights that came out of the study. I'll try to make sure we have some time at the end to sort of talk through other questions that may relate to the Midwest or broader topics. But if you've already seen the report, then you'll be familiar with some of this content. So just at a high level, when we zoom in on the Midwest and set this national context, the changes in the Midwest are really mirroring what's going on with the national transition. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in decarbonized electricity, particularly in the Midwest. It's much more renewable energy. For transportation, we're seeing a really big decrease in energy use as we shift to electricity, and a similar trend for buildings. So if you have seen the study, the next slides basically walk through in a little bit more detail some of the key topics that we flagged for the region. I won't read these right now because there's a slide on each of them, but the slides are really structured around the question of what is the opportunity inside this topic for the region? So understanding what did our analysis suggest the changes are, and then also teeing up some of the really important regional questions as to how to actually enable that and important considerations for making it happen. So the first is really this opportunity to shift away from ethanol towards more advanced biofuels. So I know there's a question earlier about current biofuel usage internationally. This is a US domestic picture, that very top chart. So we can see corn ethanol is really the only biofuel at scale in the US energy economy amongst liquid fuels and natural gas. So we've got the 2020 snapshot there, and then by 2050, what we're seeing is a really big shift towards decarbonized fuels and much less fossil fuel usage. So that advanced biofuels is really the key opportunity for the Midwest. So the chart below that is looking at what is the Midwest contribution to that biomass supply that's turning into fuels. So in 2020, the Midwest is a little bit over half of the biomass that goes into biofuel production. And in 2050, we see still roughly an equivalent amount. But an important piece is that the Midwest is still making biofuels, but they're not making corn now. So they're making new types of biofuels derived from potentially different biomass feedstocks. And so there's really an opportunity here for the Midwest to sort of continue this role in supplying biofuels for the rest of the country. But it's also in shifting away from corn ethanol to new advanced fuels. So those are going to be things like drop-in replacement for diesel, less likely gasoline, but also production of things like hydrogen from biomass, which will be really important for sort of the new energy economy. And some of the key enabling questions to sort of set up that transition are really around understanding what is the quantity of biomass that's actually going to be available for biofuel production. So there's a lot of analysis around this. This is something we look at a lot with sensitivities, but there are lots of questions about how much biomass can we actually use to make biofuel without potentially have adverse impacts on land use as well as food supply. Another critical question, what does the transition away from ethanol towards advanced biofuels look like in the Midwest? There are a lot of existing interest in the ethanol industry, and many of them are very politically connected. So sort of what is charting a course where that farmland is no longer producing corn look like, and how do we actually make that happen? And finally, which policies can help realize some of the additional benefits from new biofuel production? So something that's been talked a lot in the past around corn ethanol has been energy security. And we see a future where actually biofuels will play a much more important role in the fuel supply in the country. So is there policy associated with that? The next opportunity is around leading efforts on carbon capture. So this dovetails with the question Ryan just answered. So looking at it in a little bit more detail, what's happening in the US overall, we're going from levels that are very small for carbon capture today. You can't really see them on the scale of this chart, up to roughly 750 million metric tons. And you can contrast that with our energy system is about 5,000 tons of emissions today. And we see that the Midwest actually has a really important role inside that carbon capture. And the Midwest doesn't actually have all that much geological sequestration potential, but that's actually not what most of this captured carbon is going towards. It's actually going towards other fuel production. So much of this is coming from, is this advanced biofuel production comes online. One of the most valuable things you can actually do is capture the carbon that's coming off of it. So as seen in this chart, I know a lot of the discussion in the past around carbon capture, in particular carbon capture and storage or sequestration, has been around electricity generation. Our analysis is actually finding it's much more valuable to use it on biofuel production and industrial capture where you're getting purer streams. So this is really another opportunity as the Midwest makes this transition towards more advanced biofuels. It can really be a leader in what's going on in terms of carbon capture, as well as the possibility of potentially net negative emission biofuels, right? So if the feedstocks are effectively carbon neutral and you're capturing the carbon inside those feedstocks, you've now got potentially negative emission fuels. So there's some big enabling questions about getting to the scale of carbon capture. So part of that is what are the business models that would actually enable this to happen? It's still an open question. We haven't really seen things happen at scale yet, so there's stuff to figure out there. There's also questions about, it's fundamentally, there are aspects of carbon capture that are relatively mature technology, but again, it has not been done at scale. So are there going to be challenges that might slow the pace of deployment? And finally, other big questions about will policy support be needed to reach this scale? And will that really be politically feasible? There's potential analogies to what happened historically with the nuclear industry and sort of federal insurance around their operations, and would there be appetite to do something comparable for carbon capture, if it even needs it? So the next big opportunity is leading the transition to electric vehicles. So this chart is just comparing our reference case against that DDP case. And the DDP case has effectively 6 times as many electric vehicles through 2050. So this is a really dramatic shift in sort of the attributes of vehicles that we sell, as well as how we actually manufacture them. And this is a huge opportunity for the Midwest, right? Which in the past has really been seen as one of the global leaders in the automotive industry, and really taking advantage and being at the forefront of this shift to electric vehicles could help the region maintain that status. So the key questions here are really about how do regional industries continue to stay ahead and be strategically positioned, given the change that we think is needed to reach a net zero energy system. And then also questions about how quickly can we make demand materialize for these electric vehicles, right? Ryan had that by 2030 reference point of roughly half of sales need to be electric vehicles. And we know that consumer adoption decisions are really complicated. So influencing people to get to that level of electric vehicle adoption is going to be hard. And the last piece is really just understanding what the role is for policy to really enable this major shift towards electric vehicles, both in terms of production of them, as well as, again, that question about ensuring there's demand for them. So another really big opportunity for the Midwest is exporting wind. So the Midwest really has one of the best onshore wind resources in the country. And our analysis bears out that the Midwest will become a net exporter of wind and install a significant increase in wind generation to enable that. Our analysis has by 2050 about 30% of all onshore wind is in the Midwest, and that it's really helping to power the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast regions, which for different reasons have either really high load or have limited resource potential for renewables. So there's sort of a critical interconnection between the two. So to enable that scale of wind, there's questions about permitting, really to get to that scale. So we're talking about 15 gigawatts of wind generation a year, which is much more than we've done historically. There's also really important questions about that intra and interregional transmission. So if we're going to be able to have the Midwest power the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, that's going to require new transmission. And in the past, new transmission has been very difficult to build. There are also really important questions about cost allocation. So to the extent wind is being built in the Midwest to help the Southeast meet its own regional targets or decarbonization efforts, how do we ensure that costs are allocated equitably, which some structures right now don't do a great job of? And the final piece is just understanding if wind technology cost and performance improve faster than what we're forecasting, what does that mean? If they improve more slowly, what does that mean? So just a couple more slides and we'll move to questions. So another piece here is we've talked a lot about how electrification is sort of a pillar of decarbonization. That's still true in the Midwest. There's a really big opportunity there, particularly tied to the high heating load in the region. So this chart is showing the 2020 snapshot for the US and the Midwest of what is the breakdown of final energy demand for buildings. We see in our DDP case, there's a huge shift away from natural gas towards electricity. And that's principally going towards heat pumps. So with such high heating loads, there's a really big emission reduction opportunity inside the Midwest. And there are heat pumps that have really evolved pretty significantly in the last decade, and they're heat pump technologies which could be suitable for Midwestern climate and offer really meaningful energy savings. So for the electricity system, there's sort of a big enabling question of if we shift from being peak demand in the summer to being peak demand in the winter, how do we manage that? There's some other implications about what happens with power outages in the winter if people's heat goes off. There are also really important equity and distributional impacts by moving to electricity for heating. So there's low income programs that particularly are focused on this, but heating is typically associated with gas. And so that's a really big shift. Another big question, which there's been some national discussions about, is the role of gas utilities, particularly those that have gas efficiency programs. So how do those fit in a future that looks so different? And finally, just how do we really ramp up deployment of electrified technologies through efficiency programs? How can we help them evolve to do something much faster? So another really important question for the region is what happens with coal. So coal phases out by 2050, it's entirely offline, but the really big questions are about understanding what replaces that coal once it leaves the system. So our analysis finds that there's a new role for natural gas, sort of complementing renewables. So in the top chart, we've got capacity. So how many gigawatts of each of the resource type are there, again, for the US versus the Midwest. And by 2050, all the coal capacity is gone and actually gas capacity increases. But a really important thing to understand is while that's happening, with generation from gas capacity, it goes down dramatically. It's on the order of 5% of hours of the year it's running. So it's a really different world than we have in today, where most gas plants are running closer to 60% of the time. So that gas is actually, that gas capacity that replaces coal is really there for reliability purposes. So while most of the energy generation from coal is replaced by renewables, the gas is still there to provide reliability services. So some of the enabling questions for sort of this transition out of coal into new things is, how quickly should the coal plants be retired? How do we ensure that when replacement decisions are made, that those decisions are really made about long-term thinking? So what do those plants need to do in 2050 rather than in the next 5 years? And finally, big equity questions around managing the impacts of jobs and communities closing. So, this is a much smaller scale example of investment flows change as we go to 2050, and that has real impact. So how do we manage those? So nuclear generation, it looked like there were questions in the comments about this. So yeah, our analysis includes nuclear as a potential option for decarbonization. but we find it is not cost competitive to really large scale renewables. But what we do find is cost competitive is if you are allowed to relicense existing nuclear plants, it will save you money to do that rather than to shut those plants down and build new decarbonized generation sources. So that's a particular consideration for the Midwest as well. It has about a fifth of nuclear generation capacity. And so, there are very difficult questions to be had about how much nuclear will retire in the region, as well as really the associated question about how do we replace that nuclear energy when it does retire. All right, and so the final slide is really just looking at all of our analysis and some of the key questions that we saw. We basically distilled sort of two critical implications for about trying to bring some of this long-term planning insights into more near-term and mid-term decision making. And the first is really, it sort of loops back to the very beginning of the presentation where Ryan described this backcasting approach of understanding what needs to happen by 2050. And this is basically stating a similar idea in a slightly different way, and that's that long-term planning, as well as coordination across sectors and geographies, is really essential towards creating this shared vision of a desired pathway to 2050. Right? It's hard to define sort of what equitable outcomes look like unless we actually make sure we hit the target and then start working back from there. And then the final piece is really trying to maintain a focus on long-term goals, even when we're doing near-term policy to advance decarbonization. So with that, we can do questions again.
Great, thank you, Jamil. And I think you did answer some of the previous ones on the nuclear. Sada just asked, so if about the why low nuclear, it's basically cost. Yes, it's not necessarily public opinion, but it's overall operating cost.
Yeah, in our analysis, it's just driven really by capital and operating costs. So
I'll just mention the one place where we do find nuclear to be cost competitive, and really an Achilles heel of a lot of the pathways that we've shown is if you're not able to build renewables at the pace and at the speed that we're implying, and there are a lot of reasons why that could be very challenging. Then nuclear is both cost competitive and could even be necessary, depending on how constrained exactly we are on the renewable side.
That's actually a good segue. So I'm going to assume I have until 15 after. Is that right, Eric?
Yep, that works. Although this is Thomas, not Eric. So
sorry. Lodi, do you want to ask your question? I think that kind of ties on to what we were just discussing.
Yes, thank you. I had a question regarding the key enabling questions you discussed on each of the opportunities, and was wondering whether, given the potential delays, such as like failure to implement the policies, or if the opportunities you discussed are not taken up as quickly as expected, are these accounted for when you say that we can meet net zero by 2050, or are they not accounted for at all?
So I think this is really where some of the sensitivities that Ryan raised come up. So our proposition that it's achievable is that these are all paces that are, while not always necessarily in line with historical scale, or representative of other sort of national scale efforts that we've seen. But particularly the questions around sort of consumer adoption decisions is an important one, and that's one that we've looked at a lot with sensitivities. So Ryan already briefly addressed, we look at one particular sensitivity where what if all of our electrification assumptions are roughly delayed by 10 years? And it's still possible to hit our 2050 goals. It's just the resources that we're depending on doing and relative effort across sectors looks different.
Luis, can you ask your question on soil degradation? I think that's a really interesting one.
Yeah, and thank you, Elena, Ryan, and Jamil for talking to everybody today on the panel. My question was basically just with all the forward projections involving biofuels and the United States and Brazil being the top 2 leaders in biofuel production, soil degradation already has kind of been a problem. So I was wondering if you guys are implementing that into your projections, or that's kind of like in the technology development section, which other people will take over. I was just wondering how you guys were implementing that.
Yeah, so It's a great question, and I could just speak to one of the. So the source of our biofuel potential in the future is a study done in 2016 called the Billion Ton Study. It was done by the Department of Energy. It was kind of they did 2 studies, so this is Billion Ton Study number 2. I'll just mention one of the I think opportunities that we have in the transition for biofuels is that corn tends to be relatively resource intensive, including a lot of fertilizer use and pesticides, herbicides. I think some of the biofuels that we have the opportunity to move towards require less water and less of kind of the fertilizer, pesticide, herbicide combination, which is the source of a lot of issues, particularly downstream, in some cases literally here. So that there is an opportunity there, but I think there are, as you kind of imply, a lot of open questions about, exactly how much biofuels can we do, at what scale sustainably, and further questions about impact on food and food prices as well.
Thank you.
Samuel, do you want to step in on your question? I don't think we ever talked about offshore wind at all.
Yeah, basically my question was like, how does that play in? I know you're talking about Midwest being basically like the responsible for generating most of the wind energy for the United States looking forward, but I know that the highest actually wind speeds are off the coast of the upper Atlantic region. So I was actually wondering about transmission specifically about that. How would that play into it economically, and how would that work just in general? Is that also high cost?
So we have a significant amount of offshore wind, which is part of our least cost solution in New England and in New York. If you look at the wind speeds, the further you go south, the kind of poorer the wind resource becomes. And one other factor here is that New York and New England have some of the highest transmission costs because we have not a lot of available land in that area. So the idea of putting a bunch of offshore wind in New England for export to the rest of the country is probably not tenable given the size of the load that already exists there. But the question is, when you go further south, especially in the Southeast, where the onshore wind resources are poor and offshore wind resources also are not as good as further north. That's one place where the Midwest and where wind exports from kind of the regions that Jamil is talking about can potentially play a pretty big role. Yeah.
I think we are just out of time. I know there were a few questions about delivering our content and visualizing our content and making it available to policymakers and public. All really great questions. So this was a phase 1 of this project. We work as a nonprofit, and it's very much commissioned by different stakeholders. So I'm actually working with colleagues now to think about what a future program of work building off of what we've published so far and what we presented today. So TBD is my cheat answer. But thank you, everybody. And thank you, Ryan and Jamil. Awesome presentation. I'll pass it back to you, Eric and Thomas.
By the way, Elena, Jamil, Ryan, thank you so much. That was great. There's a lot. I guarantee this is going to continue to spark conversation and thinking. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And by the way, always use American Energy Society. Whenever you want to get the message out there, we've got the audience, so please use us.
Absolutely. Thank you guys. Great questions, and it's inspiring to have a group of your size and your caliber kind of talking about these difficult questions. So we appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Great.
Thanks.
Great.